in 2023, two-thirds of all donations came from just 19 rich people, 19 millionaires and billionaires. That's how concentrated. It's you could fit them into the back of a club or something. It's just probably where they're hanging out, somewhere in Mayfair.
Okay, so I'm actually going to start with asking you a question, Kojo. So you are the host of this new podcast series, Death in Westminster, and it begins with this story of Jula Romesh, a man who died while street homeless on the doorstep of Westminster. And the story gained a lot of press coverage at the time, but the thing that was rarely mentioned is that when he died, Westminster, the place that he died, was a borough with a very disproportionate, one of the highest proportions of long-term vacant properties in the country. So what you had was a man dying of street homelessness, or at least while being street homeless, and surrounded by empty homes. So can you tell us a little bit about why Jula's story really, what it represents to you, and why you wanted to do this podcast starting with his story? What does it represent to you about wealth inequality in Britain today?
Thank you, Dalia. I think part of the reason the Jula story always stayed with me is that, as an academic, I try and talk about, wealth inequality, wealth tax, offshoring, to classrooms quite regularly. And, I might be, talking about, the constitutional structure of overseas territories, and I can see my students' eyes glazing over. I might be talking about special purpose investment vehicles, and they're literally texting each other on the phone, half asleep. But when you talk about housing, when you talk about the ability to put a roof over your head and the ability to actually support yourself on a day-to-day basis, this is what people viscerally experience wealth inequality is impacting on them. And nobody did that impact more cruelly than with Jula Romesh and his story of dying outside the underpass outside the Palace of Westminster. I first read about the story in 2018. This was, the era of endless Brexit debates. It might seem like a different world now. We're talking about the EU backstop and about, what type of exit deal we'd have from the EU. And in the middle of all this endless arguing about Brexit, just popped up this story of a human being dying, and, the pathologist who we speak to in our podcast put as part of his actual death certificate cause of death, homelessness, because he was like, homelessness is the reason why this person ended up dying. He died outside the Palace of Westminster, which is where our politicians are supposed to represent us. And this isn't something that happens everywhere in the world, that you just have people dying outside the place of governance. But for me, the added cruelty was reading about that story and knowing through some of the research I was doing on offshoring, that Westminster is the leading place in the United Kingdom for offshore-owned properties, long-term empty home properties, and housing used as essentially a safety deposit box for the most wealthy people in the world, rather than as a place of shelter for human beings to be able to rebuild their lives. And I just thought, right there, you saw the real juxtaposition between the world of living, breathing human beings and the world of assets. And when we talk about shelter, when we talk about protection, what's more worthy of protection and shelter? Is it taxes, is it wealth, or is it actual people? And I thought that Jula's story would be a great opportunity to really discuss these broader issues that can seem quite abstract, that, like people mentioned before in the panel with Pfizer and Hannah, when you talk about wealth tax, people are always like, oh, it's so complicated. You can never possibly understand the levels of complexity behind this. But when you talk about a story like Jula's, you can see how this impacts people in a very clear and very understandable way.
And so what made you reach out to Peter and Stephanie to join you in this journey?
I needed people who understood how this sort of stuff works. And so it's the same thing reading in a textbook, but I knew from having worked with both of them in different areas before that they had an inside understanding on how the system of private wealth management works with Stephanie, or how this offshore wealth that we often, when we talk about tax havens, we always have this idea of like the tax running away to these Caribbean islands, never to be seen again. But I think what's really great about Peter's work as well is shows that, no, it comes flying back into the UK and it buys up property or buys up politicians or erodes democracy. And so I thought I needed some guidance on this journey, and they were two of the first people that I called.
So I'm going to start with you, Peter, because, you really are one of the few journalists in this country who has sort of made it your mission to really dig into this question of dark money. I'm sure the Institute of Economic Affairs has a dartboard in their office with your face on it. You really have made it your business to be in their business.
They don't respond to my emails, I should tell you that.
So can you first just tell us, what is dark money? That is the title of this event is about dark money. What is dark money? What do we mean by that?
It's a really good question. There's quite a simple answer, and people have always asked me this, because I take the title really of my book almost from the same Dark Money, the classic book by Jane Meyer, who's a fantastic journalist in New Yorker, who wrote a book of that name, which was all about the kind of unseen money which had effectively bought American politics. And in some ways we're living through that now. She was talking about the Koch brothers, but others. But effectively dark money is money that you cannot see, that enters the political system and does things that you can't see because you can't see the money. And it matters because in some ways the darkness is the point. So it can be secret donations to politicians. It can be, as we talked about in the podcast, people like the IEA who don't declare their donors. So you don't know where their funders come from, but they come around starting to take positions about why tax havens are a good thing. These kind of what they might describe as heterodox positions. But actually, really that's a code for positions that no sane person actually takes, but they're funded to take. It can also be things like online disinformation, all that kind of world too. Increasingly, I think there's other things like media as well. Even I think you could talk about GB News in that context. But effectively, it's about how money that you can see, it evades the kind of transparency mechanisms of our politics. And the more I've done this work, the more I think that actually is often the crucial money. And the darkness isn't just a kind of a sleight of hand because someone doesn't want their name to be out there. It's absolutely intentional. It's completely it's innate to it because that's how it has its power. If the IEA, for example, said, actually, do you know what? Yeah, we get money from that tax haven, we get money from those three fossil fuel companies. They couldn't go on the BBC every time. Every time they'd be on the BBC, someone would ask them about it. So it's all of that. It's how it shapes and changes our politics in ways that we just can't see.
And why do you think so few journalists really tackle this question in the way that you are? Because it seems like a sort of defining question of our political moment.
I think so. What I often say is that, like, I'm in Westminster, but not of it. I don't have a lobby pass. I'm not in there all the time. I think we have a system of journalism that's not unique to Britain, but Britain's one example of it, where access is a huge part of political journalism. I did a story recently about Labour Together. Some of you might have heard of the story. It was about how Labour Together had paid basically a private intelligence firm to spy on journalists, an American private intelligence firm. Eventually, Josh Simons, who was running Labour Together at the time, became a cabinet office minister. He had to resign on the back of it. That was a story that I couldn't get anybody in Fleet Street to take off my hands when I published it. And I think it does speak to a kind of fundamental lack of curiosity about these things at times. And that was a story about money in politics. It was a story about money buying. In that case, actually, hilariously, that money was used to try and investigate and smear the journalists who were reporting on Labour Together's, guess what? Undeclared funding that paid for polling and campaigning that helped Keir Starmer win power. And the crucial thing about this is this can often be quite small amounts of money. In this case, it was about £750,000 of funding. It's not nothing, but it's not that much, but it can buy things that you can't see. In that case, Labour Together didn't want anybody to see that they were campaigning, that it wasn't a cross-party, or it wasn't a kind of cross the various wings of the Labour Party movement. It had a particular political goal. Because it didn't declared out that money, you couldn't see it. And I think that's a crucial thing. And in terms of why there's that lack of curiosity or lack of questions about it, I do think it comes down often to this world in which political journalists are very close, I think, at times to the source of their stories, very close to the politicians themselves. And they don't, I think, often want to kind of ask these sort of questions. I think it does come down to people getting a bit too close to the sources of the stories that they're working on.
So Stephanie, I mean, you have been described, I don't know if you've just been described by me as this, but I'm going to give myself the third person here. You've been described as a recovering private wealth lawyer. Can you tell us, what exactly was your job when you were a private wealth lawyer? And what was it like to leave that industry?
Yeah, it's a good question, because even other lawyers don't necessarily grasp what the work of a private wealth lawyer is. And so to sort of locate myself in that particular part of the profession I was part of. I'm a non-practicing solicitor now, but I was a private wealth lawyer for a decade. And basically what that meant was I was entrusted with managing other people's wealth, their financial affairs. There was a saying in the industry I was in that we would take care of people from the cradle to the grave. And so anything to do with their wealth, whether it was managing inheritance or structuring wills so that people would optimize tax and setting up trusts and a variety of different things that would ensure the smooth succession of wealth from one generation to another. And so that's what I did for a decade. And it was a bit of a strange profession to find myself in, given the background that I had. And it's a really peculiar part of certainly the legal profession, but the private wealth industry itself is much broader. It comprises wealth managers, investment advisors, tax advisors, accountants, as well as private wealth lawyers. So there's this whole ecosystem of bureaucrats that are dedicated towards maximizing profit, maximizing and preserving wealth for future generations.
And I mean, I just want to clarify for our audience, you weren't just a private wealth lawyer, you were really successful, you were really good. You were on the precipice of making partner when you decided to leave, and that, which, you were very young at the time. So what was your kind of light bulb? Because not many people walk away from a career like that. So what was your light bulb moment that meant that you said, no, this is no longer aligned with what I want to be doing, and I want to found the Good Ancestor Movement?
40% of the money laundering that goes on in the world goes through the City of London or offshore jurisdictions, which are the Crown dependencies and the overseas territories, the two types of basically, what we might think of offshore as part of Britain, this kind of oversights. And so there's one place called the British Virgin Islands, about 50,000 people in the British Virgin Islands, but there's millions of companies on the British Virgin Islands, millions and millions and millions. And I'm always really struck in my work, so I'll often look at like political donors. Actually, just for example, we talked about Reform recently. Reform just took a couple of big donations recently, and if you look at the companies, I wrote about one of them. If you look at a couple of these companies, where do they end up? When you look at who owns them, you end up in the British Virgin Islands. That happens all the time in the work that me and my colleagues at Democracy for Sale do. So often the kind of people you end up writing about have got their companies in British Virgin Islands. Why? Because it's a secrecy jurisdiction, because it's very hard to find out who owns these documents. It's why the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers are such huge moments. Remember back where we had these huge offshore leaks of information. Actually, really interestingly, the person who leaked the papers actually said, I think it was, it's in the podcast, that one of the reasons they did it was because of this offshore jurisdictions were contributing so much to inequality around the world. But the secrecy is absolutely crucial, because it means that you can you do not know who owns these companies. So you can move money around. It's how you can evade sanctions as well. We're supposed to be sanctioning all these, say, Russian oligarchs, for example. It's very, very, very easy to move your money around. And especially if, like, actually Roman Abramovich being a good example, apparently Roman Abramovich still hasn't given the money from the sale of Chelsea to help Ukraine. Surprise, surprise. But this is how this works. And you have these shell companies after shell companies after shell companies. So it makes it really hard to trace where assets are. It makes it really hard to trace where the ownership of companies are, and fundamentally makes it then really hard to figure out, who's even who owns a piece of land or piece of property. Like, so much property in the City of London is owned by trusts that are based in offshore jurisdictions. We've had some improvement from government on this in terms of beneficial ownership, but it's still there's still loopholes. It's still, as time and again, there's these loopholes around trying to find out where the beneficial owners of incredibly expensive properties are, in places like Bishop's Avenue and in other parts of London, where properties can be worth 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 million pounds. And the secrecy is, and I think it's worth mentioning as well, the people who enable this secrecy. I don't want to bring you back to your place again. I know it is. I agree with I think the Chaise Lounge would be probably better, actually. But these industries, these enabling industries, the lawyers, the reputation managers, the reputation lawyers are part of it. The people who take out lawsuits against journalists who stop reporting on are part of it. The accountants are part of it. And the PR people are part of it. Often these people also employ PR firms to help launder their reputation. So all of this, and Britain is a world leader in all of these industries, actually, it has to be said. We will, it's the number one, like,
it might be the last thing that
we don't hear about.
We
don't hear about this enough. The government likes to talk about how we're a world leader. We just don't talk about this enough, do we?
I mean, so Stephanie, the majority, you did told us something really insightful there about the kind of panic about the idea of Corbyn coming into power and the taxing that might happen as a result of that. I'm interested to know what was happening in the industry when the Panama Papers were released, or when these kind of big leaks of documents where that question of secrecy and that opacity that's so important to the industry kind of got pierced. Did that spread a kind of similar amount of panic, or was it seen as something that this happens every so often and we've got enough of a grip on this that we'll get through it?
Yeah, I think that there was, the firm that I worked for and the practice that I had was principally working with domestic clients, so people living in the UK with assets here, and predominantly, their main connection to home, was the UK. But, obviously naturally being based in London, which is the centre of international finance, you don't have to go far until you run into, what was formerly a non-dom, or, people that wanted their piece of the pie in, like, Westminster or Kensington and Chelsea. And so I'd find myself dealing with different parts of the elephant, as it were. It might just relate to sort of property in prime location property in London, and that sort of thing. And so I wasn't sort of deeply involved in firms that were named in some of those, or branches of firms that were named in the Panama and Paradise Papers. There was, of course, an initial sort of shockwave, but you were just speaking to the reputation management, PR, let it wash over. But I always found it really interesting that people wouldn't, there'd be this activity in the press, but people wouldn't really focus on the kind of the ecosystem that props up the offshore world. They wouldn't zoom into it. And so, looking at the Epstein files, you don't think about, his executors, the people that are administering his estate, who are his trustees and, continue to manage the assets in his estate. We don't think about that. And so there's almost this enclosure that the private wealth industry is so gate-kept it doesn't really exist in our imaginations as kind of ordinary people, and so people don't tend to think about it. So yeah, it was always really interesting to me that it didn't become it didn't snowball, and that we just look back and think, oh well, that was an interesting thing that happened.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Epstein files there, and I think for many of us that was our first sort of insight into how this kind of world of dark money, as it were, operates. And a lot of the press was very interested in who are the big names, who are the famous names, the Andrew Mountbatten Windsors, the Peter Mandelsons that might be mentioned in these emails. But I actually was very interested in the people that we've never heard of, that would have come up a lot. And I think that's sort of a lot of what you do, Peter, is kind of looking at the unnamed but very powerful people that are involved in these flows of capital. Is there a particular investigation or story or case that you can tell us that you think really crystallizes how this offshore system of wealth and sort of tax havens shapes political power in this country?
I think it's in some ways there's lots of examples of how offshore money has come into Britain, and it's really striking, whether it's Lord Ashcroft, the big Tory donor for many years, who's based in Belize and has had a huge influence on the Conservative Party for many years. He's named in the Pandora Papers. If you watch that panorama, it's very funny. I can't remember who the journalist is, but he ends up kind of following Lord Ashcroft into the toilet at a Tory Party conference, because Lord Ashcroft's trying to get away from him, and he doesn't realise he's gone into the toilet, so he's kind of stuck. It's worth a watch. But so it's kind of suffused a lot of the kind of money. We talk about, was it mentioned earlier, Christopher Harbour, now the biggest donor in the history of British politics. He's based in Thailand. We had Richard Tice at the weekend. He's not, he's talking about basically the Sunday Times did a good story showing how he'd avoided about £600,000 in corporation tax, and he's saying every person should minimise their tax. Most people don't get the choice to minimise their tax. They get paid PAYE or whatever, they don't get that choice. But I think that tells you a lot about the attitudes that suffuse around this. But I think rather than thinking about what I'm really struck by is just the extent, because our politics runs on private money. So I think people don't really often realise this. We have unlimited donations. You can give as much money as you want in British politics. America actually can't. But in Britain you can give as much money as you want. It's only a tiny, small number of people who do. There's some research by Transparency International that in 2023, 2/3 of all donations came from just 19 rich people, 19 millionaires and billionaires. That's how concentrated. It's you could fit them into the back of a club or something. It's just probably where they're hanging out, somewhere in Mayfair. But this is the world in which this happens, and I think that's why when you talk about why don't we do things around tax, why have we still got a system in which overseas territories and the City of London is itself, people think of offshoring as going to another country. It just means moving tax to another country, as Kojo's nodding furiously, going, yes, because you always think it's in a sunny place, but it doesn't have to be a sunny place. It can rain in the City of London, but it's still offshoring. Sorry, I'm digressing here, haven't I? But effectively, what this is all runs along this, and I think that is the thing. And the ease with which you can move money into different businesses. You can give money. I think probably the most famous example was the Brexit referendum, where Aaron Banks, who was the big donor to the Brexit referendum, a lot of his money came through an Isle of Man domiciled company. So it's an offshore company, not part of the UK, not part of British jurisdiction. The National Crime Agency looked into it and did establish that we knew this had come from through this Isle of Man company, but there wasn't a problem. And the Electoral Commission found the same. And again, you were then open on to the offshore world. And this just shows you how de rigueur it is, say, for political donors to use money from the offshore world to finance politics.
No, absolutely. And just to echo a lot of what Peter said as well, I think that so often when we talk about the offshore world, when we talk about these kind of global networks of finance, we assume that they are distant, they are remote, that they're hidden in these Caribbean tropical paradises, that, when the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers get released, you get a couple articles saying, well, these are in the Cayman Islands, as though they're these, these very kind of derogatory language about these corrupt Caribbean islands when these are British overseas territories. Like, these fly the Union Jack, they have the King as the head of state, they ultimately answer to Westminster. And I think it's fascinating that when we talk about the kind of offshore financial territories, people are like, well, it's distant Caribbean territories, there's nothing we could do about it over here in Westminster, they're not really part of Britain. But the very same voices, when you talk about maybe another of the British overseas territories, like the Chagos Islands, then all of a sudden that really is British. And anybody, not intervening in the Chagos Islands, you're a traitor if you talk about the Chagos Islands having its own, jurisdictional orbit. And so that duplicity, I think, is really, really indicative of the way in which this system is structured to favor power in one way and then deny accountability in another way.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we just had Hannah Spencer on, and she talked, and obviously after she won, there was all this conversation around sectarian Muslim voting perverting democracy, but somehow 19 individuals being responsible for the majority of political financing is not sectarian or corrupt somehow. But I want to kind of again root us back in Westminster, because oftentimes, and it was on the earlier panel as well, the system of offshore wealth was described as Britain's second empire. Could you guys speak a little bit to what actual leverage does Westminster have, and us as British citizens, to whom Westminster is meant to be accountable to, what leverage do we have in stopping this system that is not only bankrupting and extracting from Britain itself, but also from the world itself? What role is Westminster playing in that?
I can speak a little bit to this. I think that, not at all. Mentioned in book, which is available at all good bookstores in here. But often, we try and minimize the role that the United Kingdom plays in this global structure of offshoring. And the reality is offshoring is a global phenomenon, and it won't be solved solely by the United Kingdom. We can look at international initiatives like the UN global minimum tax rate that's being lobbied for at the moment, but the reality is a lot of it does still flow through the United Kingdom. The Tax Justice Network in 2019 considered the top 3 corporate tax havens of the world to all be British overseas territories: the Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, and Bermuda. And the professional services, which obviously Stephanie has spoken about, the lawyers, the investment banks, the hedge funds, the property, often flows through Westminster as well. And so if we want to think about ultimate responsibility and ultimate ability to be able to intervene in the system, then we need to be looking at Westminster as the center of this, what Nicholas Shaxton calls this kind of second global empire. And what can the politicians in Westminster do? So with the British overseas territories, they're quasi-autonomous. So they have independent legislative bodies, assemblies, and then they have those assemblies will respond back to Westminster and to the British Crown ultimately. But the highest court of appeal in these territories still remains the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, this kind of shadowy court within the monarchy that even most British people don't know exists. They still run the Union Jack flag, and they still ultimately respond back to British government. I think what's interesting is when people talk about things like beneficial interest in these places, you actually often get the British government say, well, we would want to intervene in the British Virgin Islands, we would want to intervene in the Cayman Islands, but that would be colonialist, and we don't want to be all of a sudden, you don't want to be colonialist. That's very interesting. They will use that, though, with a straight face. But as I mentioned before, in other British overseas territories like the Chagos Islands, they will expel the entire population in order to allow the United States to have military bases set up in Diego Garcia. So I think all I would say is when people talk about the impossibility of Westminster acting on that is if you can expel the entire population of one of your overseas territories, you can probably find out who has registered a few companies in another one.
I mean, Stephanie, I guess from that more sort of technical perspective, is there anything that you have to sort of add to what can be done from the heart of empire?
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the C word, because what was on my... What I was really sitting with is that all of this is a colonial legacy, and the law is so critical to how we see this and how we can change things, because it's always been the legal architecture that has created the conditions for this kind of like highly mobile, like globalized international finance, I suppose. And so that we know that we can change the law, right? So the law is a really powerful instrument. If it weren't for the ways in which the law has been manipulated to suit colonial agendas and, British imperialism, the law has been so manipulated in order to create the kind of environment that we have now, and that really needs to change. But I think to deal with it properly, we would really need to confront our colonial legacy, and I just don't know whether we're ready to do that in its fullness.
And because obviously this is a global financial system, so what can we do sort of from within the British legal system, and what part of this would actually require a more globally cooperative movement to address the way in which money can be moved to evade taxes, to evade accountability and transparency?
So I guess Peter was speaking to like the critical importance of secrecy, and we know that the Economic Crime Act came in 2022, and my understanding is that was really kind of introduced under pressure because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And so I find it very interesting that, many of us in this room, we want to win the moral argument, right? And like we're on the side of justice, we want to combat inequality. But sometimes there are things that happen which present a narrow window where you can actually change policy. And so I think that it's about being vigilant about when those opportunities are, and there's brilliant policy work that goes on, people like Transparency International, the Tax Justice Network. The Economic Crime Act, there is still, that introduced the requirement to disclose, beneficial ownership, the real owners of UK property, but there are still loopholes, and so obviously that's something that could be changed overnight, right, if the political will was there. Dealing with transparency and removing the different veils and removing secrecy is so critical, and that is something that can be done. Obviously, it relies on international cooperation, which is a constant struggle. But I think it's certainly achievable, because there are quite discrete steps that can be taken to actually shift the direction of things.
And I mean, one thing that came up in the last panel quite significantly was this question of misinformation, astroturfing, the war of information. And Peter, a lot of your work, especially the more recent work you've done on tech, has really had a look at the relationship between dark money and misinformation. And you tell this brilliant, well, not necessarily just misinformation, but particular kinds of management of discourse and imagination. And you tell this really great story in the podcast of Dominic Raab describing the role of the Institute of Economic Affairs in British politics. And in this story, Dominic Raab is talking about swimming in the sea in Brazil, having a wonderful time. And he talks about how he's just treading water, but he finds that through no effort of his own, he has moved meters down the shore towards the right. And he basically says that the IEA kind of functions as the current that pushes, without anyone realizing, that pushes the British political system to the right without even realizing. Could you outline for us just the history, not just of the IEA, but of that relationship between the management of ideas and the propagation of ideas and dark money?
Yeah, it's a fascinating history. I do talk about it a bit in the podcast. The IEA, it kind of came into being in the 50s, and it is a great story. It's a guy, Anthony Fisher. Anthony Fisher was he was a chicken farmer who made lots of money by basically his chickens got sick, and he made lots of money off the government, and he decided he wanted to go into politics. And he'd gone to see Friedrich von Hayek, the famous neoliberal economist who was teaching at the London School of Economics, and he'd read a Reader's Digest version of The Road to Serfdom, which was Hayek's very famous book and very much influenced Margaret Thatcher, and it shows the power of the Reader's Digest, which I guess no longer exists. But he read this, he liked the cut of this jib, and this was post-war Britain, so they basically both conservatives and I won't dwell on the point too long, but both Conservatives and Labour basically actually had a very similar statist view of the economy. It was a post-war years, and Fisher did abhor this himself and a guy called Major Smedley, the wonderfully named Major Smedley, who set up the Institute of Economic Affairs together. But he went to see Hayek, and he told Hayek, look, I'm thinking about becoming a politician. Don't like this, don't like the system, I want to change it. And Hayek said, don't be a fool, don't become a politician. What you want to be is you want to be the person who's got the ideas that the politicians can pick up and use when they need them. And he told me he should set up a think tank, and he should give it the blandest name possible. So he called it the Institute of Economic Affairs, which, to this day, it sounds incredibly. When I first started, this is another digression, I apologise, but when I first started following these guys, I assumed that this was like something like the Institute of Fiscal Studies or something, I assumed these were proper people. It was after the Brexit, it was years after the Brexit referendum, and I realised it was actually just a bunch of 20-year-olds with like nice plummy accents and who could put out policy papers that were like diaphanously thin, but they would get on the television. I was like, wow, this is, so this is what it came from. So he set up this institute, the Institute of Economic Affairs, and this was the idea. And they used to have, they set up an office near Westminster. They'd have, curly sandwiches and a couple of glasses of wine at lunchtime. People would come, Labour and the Tories. They had real influence, and one of their leading lights actually was Enoch Powell in the 60s as well. Powell was a big supporter of the IEA, as were others too, and actually in the Liberals as well, the kind of a splinter of the Liberals. They're fascinating. Their extent to which they were kind of implicated in politics was huge. And what's really fascinating, I found, was like kind of tracing that genesis. Became very big under Margaret Thatcher. So a lot of people might have heard of Tufton Street. And so Tufton Street is basically more of these sort of think tanks. And they were very influential under Thatcher, and then again under in the Brexit years. But what we're seeing more and more, and one of the reasons I'm so interested in them is because they don't declare who funds them. And you can give money from anywhere to these think tanks. And actually what we're seeing is this is becoming more and more part of our politics. It's a huge part of American politics. I'm sure many of you will have heard of Project 2025, which is kind of became the blueprint to the Trump administration. That was put together by the Heritage Foundation, which is one of the biggest think tanks in America. And as often happens when America, sneezes, we catch a cold. We now have more and more think tanks popping up continually. And actually, frankly, if you look at some of the think tanks, whether it's Labour Together in the Labour Party or the Centre for Better Britain, which is connected to the Reform Party, they actually make the likes of the Institute of Economic Affairs look very, very independent. These are completely next to political parties. And they have the added bonus that you can give them money from anywhere in the world, and it doesn't have to be declared, and it can go and be spent to influence politics. And I can see more and more, in terms of you're talking about dark money, that is becoming more and more a function of our politics. And you can see how it's happened in the States, and actually been quite open about it. The man who runs the Centre for Better Britain, James Orr, who's kind of got some policy job as well at Reform, has talked about emulating the Heritage Foundation. Said he wants to raise £20 million. They have kind of companies that can take in money for them in Texas, Canada, and in other jurisdictions around the world as well.
I don't know why they don't like you, Peter. It's really strange.
I know, yeah. Why don't they invite me for the curly sandwiches and the glasses of wine?
Well, that's one thing that really strikes me is British politicians are so cheap.
Oh, it's so cheap. It's unbelievable.
I can't, but a sandwich and a free cup of tea and you're willing to sell your soul to the devil? I mean, who raised you? It's ridiculous. But Kojo, you also have gotten into a little bit of hot water with your digging into the IEA, and particularly the relationship between people who are advocating for no taxes on billionaires or no taxes on wealth and doing this the divisive, racist, anti-immigration politics. That's a relationship that goes way back, right?
Yeah. I'm also not popular with the IEA, not just because I'm friends with Peter. I think you gave me a bad rap, but then I think I particularly upset them when Liz Truss got elected to being the British Prime Minister for all of 3 seconds. But at that time, the IEA, which they, quiet about nowadays, but were very vocal at the time of her election, seeing her as a politician that they quote unquote incubated, along with the entire Britannia Unchained crowd. I'd really recommend anybody interested in reading this book called Britannia Unchained, which is published by Liz Truss, Kwesi Kwarteng, Dominic Raab, Priti Patel, all when they were like, it's like the Avengers of like awful
the
Tory
Avengers
PMs.
at the end of the world.
And it's all when they were like backbench MPs, nobody knew who they were, and it really lays out their vision for this kind of deregulated, free marketist vision of British society. And Liz Truss had been built up and was elected to being Prime Minister and was presented as being the return of the Iron Lady, and everybody thought that she was going to be incredible. And I wrote an article for the New York Times saying maybe she wasn't going to be incredible because she came from this particular tradition, linking them to that post-war, post-imperial emergence of the IEA, which, again, they don't like to really vocalize that now, but the first politician to really champion them in the corridors of power was Enoch Powell. That's unfortunately just a fact. I wrote this in the New York Times, and they were not very happy with me. And all of a sudden, I found all of these. I got a Daily Mail attack article. I got all of the Twitter abuse from the IEA's cheerleaders. I left Twitter at that time, and then when I went back on, a friend of mine went, "Why did you leave?" And I said, "Oh, the IEA and the Daily Mail article." And they were like, "Oh, that was really bad." Also, the Express article as well. I was like, "The Express article?" I didn't even read that one, but. Only because, my mother is a good African Christian woman, when Liz Truss and Kwesi Kwarteng then torpedoed the British economy within like a month, I did not go back to every single person who tweeted me and ask them to reiterate their defense of the IEA's vision of Britain. But I think that moment is an example of a political moment that now we tend to mock and deride, but it hasn't disappeared. The architects, the kind of ideas that inform that moment continue to have a particular vision of Britain that they now see the Reform Party as being the vehicle for. They now see the kind of ownership of the social media space as being a particular vehicle for. And I think there's a real reason why so much global capital, whether it's Russian oligarchs or whether it's Elon Musk, seem to be obsessed about Britain and seem to write about Britain and finance Britain. And I think for me, it's because if you are, looking at the laws, if you look at the systems of wealth accumulation, so much of it still flows through Britain. So much of that spider's web, as Nicholas Shaxson says, continues to orbit around the city of London.
So we've been speaking a lot today about, changing laws and doing things that feel quite out of reach for ordinary people. So for, the people in the audience, the people who are going to be listening to this on YouTube who might not feel that is something that is achievable for them as an individual, what steps can we take as everyday people to not only call for, to not only achieve a more transparent financial system, but also to break through some of this, the attack on democracy, really, that is happening as a result of this extreme wealth inequality, which is linked to this offshore tax system?
I think there is something actually in showing politicians you care about this stuff. I know it sounds like corny, like writing to your MP and stuff like that, but like if you look at it, I think if you think about like taking these moments, as you said, like when do you take these moments for change, how do you engineer these moments? How do you show people you care? Like it's actually an issue of secrecy. In the last 2 days, the FT has published 2 pieces about, yesterday they published this piece about how the Chinese were using freedom of information legislation to get like state secrets and how anonymously briefed and how we need to tighten up FOI. And today there's another piece, another anonymously brief piece about the government is considering, like tightening access to freedom of information. This is something we really care about, democracy for sale. FOI is one of the few tools citizens have to try and find that information. Anyone who sent an FOI request will know it's bloody broken. It's really hard to get information out of any authority whatsoever, particularly the central government. The great irony is the more someone's in control of FOI, the harder it is to get information out of them. But these are tools of democratic accountability on some level. There's tools of civic engagement and civil liberties. And I think people have to show that they care about these things. Like, you do actually have to go, look, I care. Whether it's writing to your MP, sometimes it is as stupid as there seem to be on X. I'm not on X anymore. Atting politicians and going, don't do this. There is something about showing people you care. And I think this is something you kind of forget the importance of kind of institutions of civic life, the organizations, whether it's Tax Justice Network or something like that, or whoever the organizations are, of engagement, of actually showing people you care about it. It doesn't all happen. I think sometimes we think about politics as something that just happens at Westminster, just happens purely behind these closed doors. Politicians are also scared as well. They're scared of voters. And so voters making noise about something, it can feel really hard. It can feel really atomized. It can feel like these are, and you can end up in technocratic conversations. And I think that does put people off. And the problem with this stuff is it is legal. It is in one level technocratic because the industry, the reputation. I'm sorry, Stephanie, constantly turning to you, going, "Your industry," but the reputation management industry that exists out there, that exists because of the laws we have. When we change those laws, what they can do changes. So it is a legal thing. It does require law. It does also require really, really sharp, informed spokespeople at the head of that. So it needs people to come forward as well. It needs people with a platform to come forward and say they care about it. But I think it's all of those things.
I'm thinking about, what you just said, Peter, being able to demonstrate that you care. Well, before you can do that, you need to really know and understand what's happening in ways that make sense to you in day-to-day life. So I was looking at office space quite a few years ago, and went to a place in Brixton which seemed, quite nice, and I was asking various questions about the space. And then I asked the person who was showing me around, well, who owns this building? Because I'm always really nosy and trying to understand who owns what. Because, half the high street is owned by, offshore vehicles. And sure enough, the person who was showing me around said, I don't know who the landlord is, but I know that the rent gets paid to an offshore account. So I was furious and proceeded to go and tell lots of people about this. But that's just an example of how you can engage with an understanding of what that means. That means that, that there's some offshore entity with a person or people behind it, and it's extracting wealth out of a beloved community, a place that's really important in London, a place that's undergone like rapid gentrification, and there are many other places like that in the UK that I could speak to, but that's just one example. And being able to share that and say, hey, do you know that this is what's going on, and then being able to raise concerns through different civic and electoral channels and freedom of information requests and things like that. So I think it's really important to be able to get a sense of how this is playing out in day-to-day life.
I mean, I think absolutely talking about how this stuff touches us on day-to-day life. Often when we talk about offshoring, again, we think that it's so remote and complex, but it's, often if you are trying to get in touch with a company or a landlord and you can't get in touch with it, you just end up in this endless hall of mirrors. That is usually because these are offshore companies that are protected by this veil of secrecy, and you can't actually find someone to hold accountable for when things go wrong. And so having people make that connection, I think, is a way to make it visible. But I also think just decoupling this idea of wealth and poverty from how hard people work and people's effort is going to be one of the really important ways that we can do on a day-to-day basis to just kind of pierce the ideological bubble within which this system sits. So often we are encouraged to assume that those who have wealth is because they've worked really hard or they've had great ideas, and those who are struggling and are unable to reproduce their lives is because they're lazy and because they're not clever or they didn't try hard enough. And we really moralize this distinction, and we're encouraged to do that more and more as wealth inequality kind of expands and gets harsher. It's interesting that we're seeing this rise of, more hustle and grind culture, more wake up at 6 a.m. and eat steak and eggs. And that's going to somehow deal with this global system of, wealth offshoring and extraction of resources. I think speaking to the way in which this system allows certain forms of wealth to be insulated and to grow, and others to be left vulnerable, people like Jula, who was the reason for this podcast, I think is going to be really crucial way that we can break this ideological bubble. I think, a brief kind of detour, if you allow me, just to kind of help unpack the way that we assume why people are homeless. One of the most powerful, for me, scenes in the whole podcast is when we visited a homeless charity in Barron's Court, and the person who ran the charity mentioned that we're getting more and more calls from people who say, I never thought I'd be in this position. I have a degree, I have a job, but I can't afford the rent, I can't afford the mortgage, I don't know what we're going to do. Liz Truss ruined the interest rates. So now we are really struggling and are finding themselves homeless or in temporary accommodation, and don't understand why, because they think that this is only something that happens to bad people. This is only happens to people who have made mistakes. This is only something to quickly pivot to a book my next book. Where's my next book? I have to also flash this. Forgive me, my editor is somewhere in the audience and I can't see anyone, so she could attack me from any moment if I don't flash this. But the next book is really on the drugs part, so I have this coming out in June called The Next Fix. And part of the reason I think the way that we use drugs as an ideology to justify people are homeless, I remember once, walking around, I have a little 6-year-old daughter, and, we walked past people who are homeless in a tube station like Westminster, and, she was like, Daddy, why are people, on the streets? And, I'm trying to explain to this 6-year-old about housing shortages and offshore finance and right to buy, and she's, her little brain is...
You haven't listened to Death in Westminster?
Her little brain is mangled, and then a few months later, I remember walking past a mother and a son, walking past another homeless person, Son asks the mother a very similar question. Mom just goes, oh, they're all on drugs, and just walks away without a beat. And that, I think, is the way that we rationalize poverty in this world. And I think focusing on the way that systems produce that inequality is one of the easiest ways we can push back against that.
Yeah, I have a memory coming back to me. I believe it was Richard Tice, but very happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, or at least it was someone from Reform. There was a clip of them saying, I think they were talking about sort of benefits or disability benefits. It might not have been disability benefits, but some kind of benefits. And he said, people need to get off their backside and get to work. And the people who are sitting on their backside and accumulating wealth for doing nothing are the people who have the kind of wealth and the kind of assets that they can sit back and leave it in a savings account or have someone paying rent on it. And they are the ones who are sitting back and doing nothing and reaping the rewards. And so oftentimes with these situations, most of the time, accusations are actually confessions. So we are wrapping up in about 15 minutes. So we have some time for questions. I'm going to do the same as I did last time, which is I'll take a couple at a time and I'll let our panel speak to them. So if you have a question for a specific panelist, you can say that, or it can be for the general panel. So we've got here at the lower left.
Yes, I'm a community grassroots as a community organizing. How do we combat that? How do we actually campaign and maintain the anger? Which is the thing. It's not the first time that we heard of what was with the Pandora cars or crisis. And now we would go usually people in regions with FC files. How can we maintain that public anger?
I think that's a great place to start.
Oh, thank you. They're really good questions. In terms of, I don't really try and plug what we do, but Democracy for Sale, we're actually going to be doing some FOI training soon online for people. So if you subscribe to Democracy for Sale, you'll find out more about that. So that might be useful for some things, but more generally, I think I totally hear what you're saying about how do you make people in power listen, and I think that point is the point as well about trying to mobilize people. I was thinking back as the last panel was on about, I remember covering the G7 back, and was it 2006 at Gleneagles, if you remember back then, Make Poverty History, and there was so much talk about tax, and Nicholas Saxon's book had come out not that long after his Treasure Islands, and it really felt, we were talking about Amazon and Amazon's tax affairs, and you fast forward to now, and in some ways the overarching bit of this conversation, which we haven't talked about that much, is big tech and is the oligarchy. It's the Elon Musks, it's the Larry Ellisons, it's the Zuckerbergs, the Bezoses. This is the world we're living in now, and in some ways even the world someone like me was writing about 10 years ago can feel quaint compared to now. And I think the really key thing, I think, is trying to find ways to unite all these things together, to tell these stories, like Kojo was talking about, the structural part of this, to see that they're not discreet. The reputation industry that will sue a journalist into silence is the same one that'll buy PR for Facebook and Google. These things are all connected. They're not discrete things. They're all part of a kind of a wider system. And I think that I think the more and more you can try and tell those stories, I think this is the power of storytelling. And I think stories are a huge part of this. Telling people stories that actually narrates them, like you talk about, Stephanie, with the you're going into an office block and being like, oh, this is owned by an offshore company. That is also the antidote to the story that the immigrants taking your job, and that's the reason why this country is where it is. I think probably most people in this room know that on every statistical measure that is not accurate. But those are the kind of stories that I think are much more effective to try and the final point on that, actually, I think, is if you look at there's some interesting polling done a few months ago about it was about the Reform Party and messaging around reform, and at one stage set of voters were given 3 or 4 different scenarios, and one of them was they were shown a video of a Sky News package from Migration Raid, and it was actually a package that had been put together by the government. It was basically a government PR thing, and they watched it and they were asked about their views about reform after watching it, and they were more likely to support reform after watching the video rather than less. But this was the only statistical significant piece of content they saw, except for another one, which is about who funded the reform. And they were talked about the links between the oil and gas industry and fossil fuels and the tax havens and reform's donors. And that made people less likely to vote for reform. And I think this is about showing, the more we can show and tell that interconnectedness, I think that's a really, really important thing.
So we're going to wrap it up there. Please give a huge round of applause to our incredible panel. The podcast Death in Westminster, you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Just look up Novara Media. I want to also extend a thank you to Planet B Productions, who produced the podcast, to the Joffrey Trust, to Friends Provident Foundation, without whom the podcast would not be possible. We're going to be in the bar. You should join us there. Please give a big round of applause to all of our panelists, Hannah, Faiza, Stephanie, and Peter. Thank you so much.